How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're starting Daf Lamed Ches, Daf 38. Avodah Zarah. Daf 38 is Mamish or Gewalt. Daf 38 we talk about Bishul akum. Daf 38 we talk about Bishul akum. Very interesting sugya. Who could tell me what Bishul akum is? Bishul akum is the prohibition against a non-Jew cooking food for a Jew to consume that food. Let's call it it wouldn't be kosher, quote unquote, right? A Jew would there is a gezerah d'Rabbanan against consuming that dish. Today's daf, we will define which foods does Bishul akum apply to. It doesn't apply to everything. There are certain things that you can buy from a place that it was cooked by a non-Jew, and that's fine. We're going to talk about what scenarios that those are. How can one be compliant with the prohibition of Bishul akum? You could have a scenario, let's say a caterer, or let's say you go to a bar mitzvah or something. It could very well be that the people working in the kitchen are not Jewish. So why is that not Bishul akum? So what can a Yid do to be compliant with Bishul akum? And then we'll talk about a bunch of random stuff. So related to Bishul akum, foods that we probably haven't heard of and that kind of stuff. But this is the focus of certainly the first, let's say 60% of today's daf. And I think it's going to be an interesting one. So here we go. We are going to start on daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis at the 2 dots, 3 lines before it gets wide. Sachakol about 8 or 10 lines before the bottom of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. Ve'ashlokis, and cooked foods. The Mishnah had said that cooked foods are osur b'achila but mutter ba'ano. Benanimili, how do we know this? How do we know that there's a prohibition, there's a gezerah against consuming food cooked by a non-Jew? Benanimili, Amr Reb Chia bar Abba, says Reb Chia bar Abba, Amr Reb Yochanan, Amr Kol, the Apostle says, Ochel ba'kesef tashbireni ve'achatu umayim ba'kesef titan li v'shasisi. Where's this pasuk from? From Sefer Dvarim. We're still in Sefer Bamidbar. Moshe Rabbeinu, I think this is Sichon. Where was Sichon? Sichon was in Cheshbon. I think that this was a dialogue between Moshe Rabbeinu and Sichon of Cheshbon. I believe what that means is sell us food, and meaning Moshe Rabbeinu was asking Sichon if he could pass through Sichon's land, right? Just to pass through, so for the right of passage. And Moses says, look, anything we consume we'll buy from you. Will be good for the economy, for the local economy. We will buy. We have plenty of food. I think the idea, right? Rashi maybe says it's al Torah. I think the idea here was we have plenty of food, but nonetheless we won't consume our own food. We'll buy from you. We'll boost the economy. And the water, I don't know if at that point maybe it was post Beresh Hamilyon, but even after that, then Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock, and then there was water. Whatever it is, we'll buy water from you, right? Does the pasuk then say rak ebra no be'artzecha or something? Which pasuk is this? Which is rak ebra b'ragloi. Just let me walk through your land, please. And of course, Sichon says no. Oh, shmendrik. Al kolponim. So kamoim. So basically, we're comparing food to water, and I guess maybe the point is he was going to consume. He was going to purchase this food from Sichon. Sichon was not a Yid. So what kind of food was he planning to purchase from Sichon? So ma'moyim shaloi nishtanu af oichel shaloi nishtana. Just like water is something that doesn't change, so long as it's water. You can boil it, you can cook it, but it's still water. So also things that Moshe Rabbeinu and the Yidden would have consumed from Sichon would have been things without change. But if that's the case, chitin vason kloyos, ochinami dasurin. So based on that, would we conclude that if you take wheat berries and put them in the oven and dry them out, then make dried wheat berries? Sounds delicious. Would that be osir? Because it changed somehow, somewhat. And if you're going to say, yeah, osir. But Vatani, we learn in the Brisa, chitin vason kloyos, that when you take wheat berries and make them into dried wheat berries, do we do things like this now? What's an example of some kind of, we have dried fruit, certainly. Do we dry, we must. I bet if you go to, this seems like the kind of thing you should be able to get in Shuk Machnuda. Rabilo, if you go to any of the nut mongers in Shuk Machnuda, they must have this stuff, right? Right, Rabilo? I guess I don't usually buy it, but they have lots of stuff there. They must have dried wheat berries. Rabilo, what do you say? Was sagst du? Was sagst du, Rabilo? Rabilo, was sagst du? Tazun v'chi tema ochinami v'atani chita vasan klois mutarin. We learn in the Brisa that wheat berries that are made into dried wheat berries are permitted. Elo kamoyim ra. Okay, so the wheat berries are permitted. So, okay, what's the comparison then to water? Elo kamoyim, like water. Ma moyim shaloi nishtanu mibiryoson. Okay, so just like water is something that, whether you have it room temperature, whether you had it cooked, it kind of, I don't know, does Rashi say anything? I don't even know, but it like stays be'etzim the same. Let's go weiter for a second. So we need food that be'etzim stays the same, meaning when you take a wheat berry and you dry it out, for example, so we said that that's permitted because, yeah, now it's a dry wheat berry. Maybe it's more enjoyable. I don't know. But it's be'etzim still just a wheat berry, right? No dramatic change has taken place. I mean, it's just dry. There's just less water content in it, right? So any kind of food that be'etzim is still the same thing, maybe just with a little bit less water content, that would be acceptable. But then, fragt die Gemara, but if that's the case, then what if you take wheat and you grind it up into flour? If you grind it into flour, so in that case, your mom is making a change. I mean, there's definitely a difference between a wheat, a bunch of wheat kernels and powder, flour. So that's the case, then it should be asun because it's changing. But if you're going to say, yeah, okay, yeah, it's osir. But But we learn in a Braise that if a Oivik Kochavim were to take wheat berries and dry them out, grind them into flour, fine flour, mutarin, that's permitted also. So ela kamoyim, rather the comparison to water is mamoyim shalin shtanu mibir yosan al yedei ha'or. Okay, so the newly defined criteria is, well, water isn't changed by fire. You heat up water, it's still water. So af ochel shlo nishtana mibir yosan al yedei ha'or. Okay, so the food from an Oivik Kochavim that's permitted to consume is food that has not undergone any change by way of fire. But midei orksib, but it doesn't say anywhere in that pasuk about fire. Who says anything about fire? Boom. Rather, says the Gemara, answers the Gemara, no, you're not going to find your answer from a pasuk because it's not midaraisa, it's midarabanan. It's gzeira derabanan bishul akum. So it's gzeira derabanan, and we're about to define what it applies to. We haven't yet defined it. We were trying to define it based on a pasuk, to which we threw that out and we said, stop, new route, new approach. This is not deraisa. We're not going to learn it out from a pasuk. It's a din derabanan. What about that pasuk of ocha b'keset tashbein v'chata, etc.? It's a asmachta. The Chacham made a gzer. It's not found anywhere in the Torah. They made a gzer. What after post ipso facto? Dennis? Post? I feel like that's a thing. Post ipso facto. Great. I'm going to use it. If it's not a thing, who cares, right? We do what we want here on Babylon Town. We have our own language. It's called Babelru. And in Babelru, post ipso facto means after the fact. So then the Chacham made a gezerah, and post ipso facto, ooh, that's nice. I like it. Post ipso facto, they applied it to a pasuk, not because it was learned for that pasuk, but it's just a kind of, I don't know, what's the deal with the smachtas? I mean, it gives it like, I guess like kind of like an aura, I don't know, I guess it gives it like an aura of credibility in some ways. It's like, I mean, you're not going to take it and like apply it to like some random thing, right? If you apply it to a pasuk, it's like, you're kind of making it official, right? I don't know, I mean, it makes sense to make it din d'Rabbanan, and if you can like, say, and you can kind of see it relates to this pasuk, it gives it a certain level of credibility, but I mean, the Gezerah d'Rabbanan is still going to be the same Gezerah d'Rabbanan, whether there's a pasuk to asmachta it on or not, right? Does anybody have any ideas there? If not, let us know post ipso facto. Post ipso facto. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchok Amar Rov. Says Shmuel bar, gewaldig. So here we go. So now we are going to define in which scenarios is Bishul Akum a thing, or is the prohibition of Bishul Akum applied? It's not every scenario. Here we go. So Amar of Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchok Amar Rov, Kol hanechol kimos shehu chai, ein bo mishum bishul ovdei kochavim. Okay, if this is something that can be eaten raw, okay, Bishul Akum is not a thing. So I'll just come up with a quick example. We're going to give examples. No, okay. Going to come up with a quick example. A carrot. Let's say carrots can be eaten raw, dates can be eaten raw. Tzimmes. If you have an Ovid Kochavim who makes tzimmes, I think, was there not, did Kramer in Seinfeld, is he a Jew? I feel like Kramer's not a Jew. And I think one time at Seinfeld, did he not make tzimmes? I think Kramer, Taka cooked tzimmes, didn't he make like a Jewish single? Did Kramer not once make a Jewish singles event and he did all the cooking? I think it did not come out very good. And anyways, I think he was making tzimmes. Could the Jewish singles have eaten Kramer's tzimmes? Chaver, what do you say? No, so based on what we said just now, could the Jewish singles have eaten Kramer's tzimmes? I would argue yes. Because what's tzimmes? I don't know, ma, what's in tzimmes? It's betzim carrots and dates, is it not? I don't know, maybe. Let's just say, maybe it's prunes taco, even better. Probably prunes. I feel like tzimmes doesn't have dates. That would be too Middle Eastern. Tzimmes is a Polish thing. It's probably prunes. That makes more sense. Akoponim. So you have carrots, you have prunes, probably some sugar. Carrots could be eaten raw. Prunes could be eaten raw, or at least dried. I mean, a prune by definition is dried, right? So I would argue that Kramer's tzimmes, there would be no shaila for the Jewish singles to eat Kramer's tzimmes. So kol hanechol kimos shehu chai, anything that can be eaten raw, where am I? Kol hanechol kimos shehu chai, ein bo mishum bishul ovdei kochavim, so there is no concern for Bishul Akum. So that is one perspective. Besura masnuachi, that is how they taught this in Surah. Bepumpedisa masnuachi. However, in Pumpedisa, who is in Surah? Rav was in Surah. I think Rav Huna was in Surah. I think Rav Chizda was in Surah. But in Pumpedisa, who is in Pumpedisa? I believe Rav Yehuda was the first Rosh Yeshiva of Pumpedisa. Pumpedisa may have been the biggest. I don't know biggest in size, but like a lot of the Amoraim were Rosh Yeshiva Pumpedisa. Starting, I believe, with Rav Yehuda was the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumpedisa, followed by Rabbah, followed by Rav Yosef, followed by, I think, then Abaye, and then Rava, I think. It's maybe even Rav Papa at one point was the Rosh Yeshiva Pumpedisa. I'd have to check that out. But there are a lot of people were in Pumpedisa. So in Surah, they taught about the raw element. Pumpedisa masnuachi, in Pumpedisa, they taught thus, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchok Amar Rov, Kosher eino nechol al shulchan melachim lelapis b'esapas. Ein bo. Mishum. Bishul of the chum. Ola al shulchan melachim. That's the other criteria that we talk about when it comes to Bishul akum. Is this a food that would be served at the table of the king? If the answer is yes, well then we have to be concerned about Bishul akum. A non-Jew should not cook that for a Jew. So long as it is a food that we would not expect at the king's table, then there's no concern for Bishul akum. Again, kol she'eino nechol al shulchan melachim lelabis bo zapas, any food that would not be eaten at the table of the king, right? We say sometimes kesuda shloima b'shaita, like the feast of Solomon at his peak, in his heyday. If those foods would not have been at Suda Shloima B'Shaita, the labas bo zapas, be eaten with bread over there, ein bo mishum yeshuli of the kuchavim. If it does not follow, if it does not pass that test, so to speak, so then Bishul akum is not relevant. My benai, what is the difference between if you say it's about can it be eaten raw or not versus is it raw, is it ola al shulchan melachim? The answer is for example, small fish. Small fish would not be eaten raw. So in terms of the first criteria, if we only had the first criteria, there would be a concern of bishul akum because you can't eat it raw. But at the same time, you wouldn't have these small fish at the Suda of the king. So therefore, it's not a problem of Bishul akum. So that is one difference. Two other differences that would be kind of the same kind of thing, not eaten raw, but also not raw ola shulchan melachim, would be mushrooms that they say over here. Mushrooms. Well, that's interesting because I thought maybe these things, what were these? Are they not truffles? In which case, truffles would. Honestly, I feel like nowadays mushrooms and truffles would be ola al shulchan melachim. But anyways, they're saying it would not be ola al shulchan melachim, and also it would not be eaten raw, I guess is the point. Interesting. Because I would have thought mushrooms. Maybe I'm defining it wrong. But anyways, something that would not be eaten raw, but also would not be raw, ola al shulchan melachim. And thirdly, some kind of a porridge, I believe. Some kind of a porridge. You would have to cook it, so it can't be eaten raw, but also you wouldn't eat porridge at the Suda of the king. Tosfos then points out that when it comes to Bishul akum, we can apply both tests to it. So therefore, if we take the small fish, for example, if we take the first approach, which is that it must be cooked, so I would say, okay, we have to be concerned about Bishul akum. But if we look at it from the perspective of the second test, which is, would it go on the table of the king? The answer is no. Well, then you don't need to worry about Bishul akum. For Bishul akum to be a concern, it must pass both tests. It must be something that cannot be eaten raw, that must be cooked, and it must also be something that you would see on the king's table. So I don't know, maybe let's say like a steak or something, or maybe a very fancy steak or something, let's say. Assuming that you were going to cook that. Maybe some people eat steak raw, and I don't know, or maybe a fancy chicken. So I don't know, if it's something that must be cooked and is rather shulchan melachim, so then Bishul akum applies. But otherwise it doesn't apply. Though I imagine that, I'm not exactly sure if the definition of ola shulchan melachim is very objective. It might be somewhat subjective, but anyways, that is the dealio with, in terms of defining which foods Bishul akum would apply to. Very, very interesting. Amar Vasya Marav, dagim getanim, meluchim, small salted fish, there's no concern about Bishul of the Kuchavim because these small salted fish, I don't know, maybe like herring or something, right? They don't cook herring, right? They like salted. So since it was already salted and you can eat it that way, so it's eaten in that state, if an Ovid Kuchavim would cook it it would be okay because it's eaten raw. Tosfos actually says something very interesting here, which is, well, the implication being that if these small fish were not salted, well, then there would be a concern about Bishul akum. But we actually just defined a small fish as one of the things that actually wouldn't be a concern of Bishul akum, because even though you have to cook it, it's not right the shulchan, it's not ola shulchan malachim. So Tosfos Taka says, well, you could say it's maybe talking about not very small salted fish. Maybe they're a little bit bigger than that. And that's why if they were not salted, it would be a concern of Bishul akum. But it's a funny thing that Tosfos points out. So so then there's no concern of Bishul akum because you can eat them in their salted state. You don't need to cook them. Omer of Yosef says of Yosef im Slayan Oved Kochavim, if an Oved Kochavim cooked them, okay, a Yid can then, right, so if an Oved Kochavim cooked these salted fish, there's no issue of Bishul akum. And if Yom Tov falls out on an Erev Shabbos, and as we learned about Masechta Beya, Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos, and you want to be able to cook on Friday for Shabbos, so you have to make an Eruv Tavshilin from Erev Yom Tov. That's be'etzim, the way we do it is I think generally we use a matzah and an egg or something, but one baked food, eis asher tofu eifu ve'eis asher tevashlu b'shelu, one baked thing like a matzah and one cooked thing like a hard-boiled egg. Now, if you wanted to use this small salty fish that an Oved Kochavim cooked, you can use that as well for the mitzvah of Eruv Tavshilin. Where am I? Where am I? Mishum Eruv Tavshilin. Ve'i avdinu Oved Kochavim kased daharsino oser. But if an Oved Kochavim then fried them up as fried fish, then it would actually be a problem. Pshita, this is obvious. Ma'odetema harsna ikr. Well, maybe it's not obvious. Maybe I would have thought, because I guess the way that you make this kind of fried fish is with fish fat, maybe like a murisa kind of thing, and also flour. So kamashman kimcheker, that the ikr is not, very interesting, the ikr is not the fat. The ikr and the fat can be eaten without cooking. The ikr is the flour, and the flour you'd have to cook. So because you have to cook that, and you're enjoying the flour which you had to cook, so actually so that would, right, we said also that would be taka a problem. But this is taka interesting. So Tosfos though, taka says over here, I think the implication of Tosfos is that actually right, because Rabbeinu Tam, Tosfos had said 2 days ago, I think, that we're not necessarily makbid, not everybody's necessarily makbid on pas Yisrael, but you could have pas akum. That's what Tosfos was saying. So Tosfos here says, be'etzim, that if you eat pas akum, well, then actually the fried fish should be okay because it's just pas akum be'etzim. Interesting. Okay, fine. I think that's what he was saying. I hope that he was saying. I hope that's what he was saying. Right. Okay. I think that's what he's saying. The be'etzim, if the flour is the ikr and it's be'etzim, it's just like it's the equivalent of bread. And if you say pas akum is okay, so then the floured fried stuff should be all right, I imagine. Okay. Amra brona amarov. If an Oved Kochavim lit the whole marsh, the whole swamp, he lit on fire. And you know what else got lit on fire in the swamp, in the marsh? The grasshoppers got lit on fire. And now you have some nice crispy grasshoppers. Maybe take like a little lemon, a little lime, maybe a little salt. Get like a little basket with like a paper towel, maybe, right, because the well, I guess maybe he didn't use oil, it just lit the swamp, he lit the marsh, and all the grasshoppers got crisp. And you collect the grasshoppers, you put them in a bowl, a little salt, maybe a little lemon. I think that sounds perfect, right? What else would you want to put on crispy grasshoppers? A little salt, a little lemon. Do you need anything else? I don't know. If you have any suggestions, let us know. So where are we? So Amar Brona Amar Rab, Rav Kram shehitzis is or ba'agam, he lit the marsh on fire. Kol chagavim sheba'agam asurim. All of the grasshoppers in the marsh are usser. That's sad. It could have been a delicious snack. Now what's the scenario where we're saying that all of the grasshoppers are usser? If it's talking about, well, they're all usser because the guy who wanted to snack, he didn't know which grasshoppers were allowed and which weren't. Well, my area ovid kochavim. Well, if that's the case, why is the role of the ovid kochavim relevant at all? The reason why these grasshoppers are usser is because he doesn't know which ones he can eat and which ones he can't, regardless of who lit the marsh on fire. Even if a yid lit the marsh on fire, the grasshoppers would be, the crispy, delicious grasshoppers would be off limits if you don't know which ones are kosher and which ones are treif. Okay, so maybe we'll suggest that it's a Bishul akum thing, that the ovid kochavim be'etzem cooked your grasshoppers for you by lighting the marsh on fire. But but would that be actually usher? That when the ovid kochavim lit the marsh on fire, would those grasshoppers actually be usher? V'Omer Rav Chonan bar Ami, Omer Pidas Omer B'Yechanan, Hay ovid kochavim dechorich reisha, that in ovid kochavim who singed the head of an animal, I reckon, so an ovid kochavim who is singeing the head of an animal, like you want to remove the hair or whatever, but along the way, while he was singeing the head of the animal, the ears of the animal, the delicious, soft ears of the animal, which the perfect way to cook them, to prepare them, would be to singe them. So mamish, by singeing the head of the animal to remove the hairs, he also cooked the ears to perfection. And there's a yid chalashing there for those ears. So shar l'meichal mine, luckily for the yid, he can enjoy those ears. Afilu meresh une, even from, I think, the tip, which is the best part of the singed ear. That sounds delicious. So we see that, well, the ovid kochavim's intention was to remove the hair of the animal. Now, along the way, the ears got prepared to perfection. That's okay. The yid can eat it. Hachanami here as well, legaluye agma kamichavin, here as well, the intention of the ovid kochavim was merely to clear out, was to clear the marsh for whatever reason. I don't know why he needed to, but for whatever reason, he had to clear out the marsh, clear away whatever was growing there. And that was his intention, not to prepare grasshoppers for Yidden. So, and therefore it would be permitted. So again, we're trying to figure out, we said this ovid kochavim burnt down the marsh, leaving lots of crispy grasshoppers. We're saying those grasshoppers are usser. We're trying to figure out why. If we're saying, well, because the Yid doesn't know which ones are kosher and which ones are not. Well, if that's the case, then why does it matter that it was an ovid kochavim who burnt everything down? And if we're saying that, well, the concern is Bishul akum, this isn't actually Bishul akum, because his intention is just to clear away the marsh, not to be preparing grasshoppers for people. So answers the Gemara, okay, le'olam delo yoda eitar ve'etami. So rather we're going back to our original answer, that the Yid doesn't know which grasshoppers are kosher and which are not. And then you ask the question of, well, then why does it matter who burnt down the marsh? Where am I? So why is it important that the ovid kochavim burnt down the marsh? It's not important that it was an ovid kochavim. It just happens to be that in the incident that happened, it happened to have been an ovid kochavim who burnt down the marsh, and the Yid was standing there chalashing, but Lemaisa, he didn't know which were kosher and which were not, so therefore he was prohibited from snacking on the grasshoppers. Gufa, we said earlier, Omar Rav Chonan bar Ami, Omar Pedas, Omar Reb Yechanan, Hay Ovid Kochavim dechorich reisha, in Ovid Kochavim who singed the head of an animal to remove the hair. Shar lemechol mine, a yid can enjoy the ear delicacies. Even from the top of the ear, the softest, most delicious part that got singed to perfection. Ravina says, Ravina Hilkach, therefore, the Hilkach hay ovid kechavim, the shar sichto la'atuna, the shar the sichto la'asuna. In ovid kechavim, who put a peg, who threw a peg into an oven because the peg got wet and he needed to dry out the peg. That was his purpose, his intention in throwing the peg in the oven was to remove the moisture from the peg, not to cook it per se, but simply to strengthen it. The cover by Yisrael Kramer. Now, before the Ovid Kochavim threw the peg into the oven, the Yid had hidden a gourd in that oven. So the shaila is, would it be considered Bishul akum? Because the Ovid Kochavim was be'etzem firing up an oven, and the Yid's gourd was getting cooked by it. So Shaper Damri say it's no problem of Bishul akum. Pshita, that's obvious. The Ovid Kochavim is just fixing his peg. He's not cooking the gourd for the Yid. Well, I may have thought that the Ovid Kochavim was cooking his peg, he intended to cook the peg, in which case he was intending to cook, and it would be a problem of Bishul akum for the gourd, because after all, also a gourd is something that you wouldn't eat raw. You wouldn't eat a raw gourd, and I guess it's also the kind of, so that's the thing. We're like, we're at, what's the definition of ol al shulchan malachim? It's like a gourd would be ol al shulchan malachim. I mean, sure. I mean, it depends how it's prepared, I guess. But okay. I mean, something that could theoretically end up on shulchan malachim. So can't anything theoretically end up on shulchan malachim? So maybe there's some things that it just obviously wouldn't. But anyways, okay. But we're saying that since the Ovid Kochavim intended merely to strengthen the peg, not to cook the peg, but to strengthen the peg, well then there was no intent for cooking, and therefore the Yid can enjoy his gourd that ended up getting cooking in the oven while the peg was getting stronger in there. So now, this is very interesting. Who could tell me why it's interesting now? Because up until now, we kind of discussed what are the foods that Bishul akum would apply to. Now, assuming that we have a food that we'd have to be concerned about Bishul akum, so then how can you be compliant with Bishul, with what's the word? With Bishul akum? How can one be compliant? As I said, for example, right, maybe you go to a bar mitzvah, and the people working in the kitchen may not be Yidden. So how does the caterer ensure that they're being compliant with Bishul akum? So here we go. Very interesting stuff. If a Yid puts meat on the coals, so the Yid put the meat on the coals, and the Ovid Kochavim comes and flips the meat, so now all of a sudden the Ovid Kochavim is taken over. Mutter, no problem. The Yid put the meat on the coals. The Ovid Kochavim, it sounds like he took over, but that's okay. Hey Chidami, why is it okay? If we're talking about a scenario where, honestly, it's very nice of the Ovid Kochavim to flip the meat for the Yid, but even if nobody would have done anything at all, the meat would have still cooked anyways. It was going to cook anyways. So like, the Ovid Kochavim, while it was very nice, he didn't really at the end of the day make a difference, because even if he wouldn't have done it, the meat would have still cooked. Well then Pshita, obviously it's permitted. He didn't do anything in practice at the end of the day, in terms of net result. Ela lav di loy ofach loy ava bashil. Okay, so maybe it's talking about a scenario where the Ovid Kochavim played a crucial role. If not for the Ovid Kochavim, that meat would never have cooked. Well, amay mutter, Bishul of the Kochavim dinu. But if that's the case, then that should be considered Bishul akum. If that was the case, it should be considered Bishul akum. Right? The Yid wasn't, based on what the Yid did, it wasn't going to cook. It's purely because of the contribution of the Oved Kochavim that the meat cooked. Well, if that's the case, then it should certainly be Bishul akum. So the scenario is actually that without the Oved Kochavim's contribution, this meat would have cooked after 2 hours. It would have taken 2 hours for the meat to cook. But on account of the contribution of the Oved Kochavim, it'll now be ready to enjoy after just 1 hour. So I may have thought, I may have thought that that contribution of the Oved Kochavim to speed up the cook time is so significant that it would be a violation of Bishul akum, Kamash Malan. So Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel is coming to teach us that this is Bishul akum compliant. That all good. So the Yid put the meat on the coals, and it would have taken 2 hours to cook. The Oved Kochavim came, flipped it over. Now it's going to take 1 hour to cook. The Yid can still enjoy the meat. Frag the Gemara. But wer Amar Rav Asi am Rav Yochanan kol shu k'maychol ben Jusai ein bo mishum bishulei Ovdei Kochavim. Ha'eino k'maychol ben Jusai yesh bo mishum bishulei Ovdei Kochavim. Interesting question. That Rav Asi said in the name of Rav Yochanan that actually the criteria for Bishul akum is at the time that the Oved Kochavim took over, what could the meat have already be considered cooked? There's a standard of cooking readiness that's called K'maychol ben Jusai. Ben Jusai was a ganef, a bandit. He was always on the run. And he didn't have time to let his meat cook well done. He didn't want to eat the meat raw. He would make a fire. He would cook it to the minimum amount. Once it was at the minimum amount of cookedness, he would eat it because he had to keep moving and staying away from law enforcement. So that's kind of the standard of the minimum amount of cooking. So Rav Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan says that if when the Oved Kochavim took over, it was already past this minimum cooking threshold of K'maychol ben Jusai, okay, then it's no problem. Then it's no problem of Bishul akum. But if it was not yet cooked to this minimum amount, i.e., it was uncooked, and the Oved Kochavim took over while it was uncooked, it would be a violation. It would be non-compliant with Bishul akum. So we see that what's important here is, was it cooked yet at the time that the Oved Kochavim took over or not? Nothing to do with 1 hour, 2 hours. So answers the Gemara also could go into Osve Besilta V'Shakli, Oved Kochavim V'Osve B'Tanur. Very interesting answer. So the Gemara answers that Reb Asi Reb Yochanan, who was talking about K'maychol ben Jusai, was actually talking about a different scenario. What scenario was he talking about? He was talking about when the meat was not on the fire. It was sitting in a basket or in a package or something like that. And the Oved Kochavim goes, picks up the meat from the basket and puts it on the grill. So it wasn't cooking bichlal at the time. The Oved Kochavim went, picked it up, and cooked it. So we're saying if it was already cooked, so it basically the Oved Kochavim picked up a cooked piece of meat, as defined by the minimum amount of cooking, it was at least Meichel ben Jusai. The Oved Kochavim picked up that meat, put it on the fire. It was already cooked beforehand, so it would not be a violation of Bishul akum if it was already cooked. If it was not yet cooked, at least K'maychol ben Jusai, and the Oved Kochavim picks up this uncooked meat and puts it on the fire, then it would be a concern of Bishul akum. I hope I didn't confuse anything there, right? If it was uncooked, if the Ovid Kochavim put an uncooked piece of meat on the grill, we have to be concerned about Bishul Akum. If the Ovid Kochavim picked up a cooked piece of meat and put it in the grill, there's no concern of Bishul Akum. So that is when the Ovid Kochavim is picking up something from a basket and putting it on the fire, but something that was already on the fire. So that's not what we're talking about. Michael ben Jusai Taman we also in a price like this. Maniach Yisrael Basar al Gabi Gecholim. A Yid can put meat on a fire. Uva Ovid Kochavim umahapech bo, and an Ovid Kochavim can subsequently come and flip it over ad sheyavo Yisrael mi beis haknessos mi beis hamedrash, until the Yid who was at shul or he was at the beis hamedrash, he's at the Daf Yomi shir, and then he comes back after the shir. And the fact that the Ovid Kochavim was keeping an eye, was managing the barbecue while he was consumed with Daf Lamed Ches of Masechta Avodah Zarah, listening to Babylon Talmud. So that's no problem that the Ovid Kochavim was managing the grill. Ve'eno choshesh, and there's no issue. Shofeses isha kedera al gabe kira. A woman can put her soup on the stove. Interesting, even back then already, the man was at the barbecue and the woman was stirring the soup. Okay, fine. Uvas ovedes kochavim, and ovedes kochavemes comes, magisa, and she starts stirring the pot. So the woman picked up the pot of soup, put it on the stove, and then the ovedes kochavemes comes and starts stirring the stove, stirring the pot, until the Jewish woman comes back from the bathhouse or from the synagogue, and also it would be not a problem. That would also be fine, right? So if the Yid basically puts the meat on the fire or the soup on the stove, and then the Oved or Ovedes Kochavim takes over from there, it is no problem. They ask a kasha. What if it's fakert? What if the Ovid Kochavim put the meat on the grill, and the Yid took over? Right? The first move was that of the Ovid Kochavim. What's the halacha there? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok kal v'chomer gamro biyad Ovid Kochavim muter. If when the Ovid Kochavim completed the work, it's nonetheless muter gamro biyad Yisrael. If it's the Yid who completed the cooking, the Kosher, certainly it should be kosher. Manami was ochit stated on Rab Bar Chanan Rab Yechanan v'Amila on Rav Acha Bar Chanan Rab Yechanan. Then sheiniach Ovid Kochavim v'Avach Yisrael, whether it was the Ovid Kochavim who placed down the meat or the soup, and the Yid took over, or whether the Yid placed it on the fire and the Ovid Kochavim took over, mutter, in both scenarios it is permitted. It's only also if the entire end to end was the Ovid Kochavim. Ravina, it says Ravina Hilchas Halacha is Rifta the sugar Ovid Kochavim. If they're making bread and the Ovid Kochavim lit the flame, the offer Yisrael, but the Yid did all the baking, did all the work after that. Inami, alternatively, Sugar Yisrael, if the Yid lit the oven, the offer Ovid Kochavim, and the Ovid Kochavim did all the baking. Inami, alternatively, Sugar Ovid Kochavim, the offer Ovid Kochavim. Interestingly, even if the Ovid Kochavim lit the oven and did all the work, all the baking, but also Yisrael v'chasu b'chasuye shaper dummy, and the Yid just came and stoked the coals a shtickle, that is also fine. So we see just any kind of, where am I? Okay. Just any kind of contribution would suffice. Toisvis, the first Toisvis on Lamed Ches Amud says, Mikula shmaite mashma, diba inache yisov mikayva bishul ktsas. That in order to be compliant with Bishul Akum, the Yid just needs to contribute epis, a shtickle. As we just saw, he could just stoke the coals a shtickle. That's it. Add a little bit of heat. What is it? That's extremely insignificant, but that is enough. And I think that I mean, without getting into halacha, because I'm not even going near there. If you have any halacha kashas, ask my friend Josh Weinberg. Anyways, but I think that's my uncle's taka caterer. I think maybe mom, send this to Mindy. Mindy, you can send it to your father, and your father can send it back to you, and you can send it back to my mom. My mom can put it in WhatsApp maybe or something like that. But I'll so I assume that something like this. So I assume that basically that's what they do. If you have non-Jews that are working in the kitchen, so I think the Yid just lights the flame, or it just does something to have some minimal contribution to what's happening there, and the non-Jews can take it from there. Dog maliach, when it comes to a salted fish that can be eaten raw, meaning eaten in its salted state. It doesn't need any further cooking. Chizkiah says that it is mutter. Doesn't need any further cooking, and that is okay. Doesn't need any further, but I think even meaning if an Oivik Kochavim salted a fish, Chizkiah says that you can eat it. That would be no problem. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, Rabbi Yochanan Aser, Rabbi Yochanan says a Yid cannot eat it because the salting of the fish is be'etzim, it's cooking, right? So I mean, if you had a raw fish and an Oivik Kochavim salted it, Chizkiah says it's okay. You can eat salted fish. Rabbi Yochanan says that the salting is be'etzim, the cooking process of it, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan says that Yid cannot eat that salted fish. He also when Rav Dimi came from Etzot to Bavel, Omar, he says, Echod dog maliach, ve'echod beya, wait, did I skip? I skipped, right? I definitely skipped. Rav Yochanan also, beya tzluya, a cooked egg, mamish, in the, like in the shell, a cooked egg in the shell. Bar kapore, shari, bar kapore says that is mutter, right? Rabbi Yochanan cooked an egg in its shell, bar kapore says mutter. Rabbi Yochanan Aser, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says also you can't eat the cooked egg. Ki also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Omar, he said, Echad dog maliach ve'echad beya tzluya, that when it comes to a salted fish and when it comes to a cooked egg, Chizkiah uvar kapara sharu, that Chizkiah and bar kapara permitted to eat the salted fish and the egg. Rabbi Yochanan Aser, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says it's also Reb Chia Parvoyo, Ikla the Reish Galusa. Reb Chia Parvoyo visited the Reish Galusa. Amrule, and they said at the Reish Galusa, they said to Reb Chia Parvoyo, Beya Tzluya. When it comes to a cooked egg, can we eat an egg that was cooked by Avodah Chacham? Amrulu, he says to them, look, Chizkiah v'Kapara shar Rabbi Yochanan also. Chizkiah bar Kapara said you can eat the egg, whereas Rabbi Yochanan said you can't eat the egg. Ve'in dvar shel echad b'makom shnaim. It says Rabbi Chia Parvoya that look, generally the accepted practice is that 2 against 1, you follow the 2 and it's mutter. Amlu Rav Zvid faithfully spoke up and said, Lo tatzisule, do not listen to Rabbi Chia Parvoya. V'hochi Omar Abaye, because Abaye said the following, Ilchasa kavosid Rabbi Yochanan, that the law is like Rabbi Yochanan, that you cannot eat the egg that was cooked by the Ovid Kuchavim. Ashkiu naguto dechalav v'noch nafshei. So they killed Rav Zvid. They drank him very powerful vinegar, and Rav Zvid Pashit died. The Reish Galusa, there was some, I think some of the people at the Reish Galusa clearly were very mean, nasty, dangerous people, and they Pashit killed Rav Zvid for ruling that they couldn't eat their egg. Aww. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said they must have really liked eggs. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, Kafrisin v'kaflutis v'amat v'hemtalio. Kafrisin were like the outer shells or something of a caper that you can eat raw, but you can also cook them. V'kaflutis, same thing for leeks. Leeks, I guess you can eat raw. We could probably eat leek raw, right? I don't eat leek much, but I can imagine it being like some kind of a salad or something. I don't know. Cheva, what do you say? Can you eat raw leeks? V'hemtalia, as well as hemtalia. V'acham and hot water. V'akloyis sheloin. Where am I? And v'akloyis sheloin. And I think maybe it's just a reference to like dried out like nuts and stuff. Nami lo nishtanu. Okay, yeah, they don't change much. Dried out nuts, I think is the point. Mutarin, they're mutar, because again, right, these things are things that you can be eaten raw. So then they are mutar. And I guess the klayos, even though they were cooked, but like they didn't change much. They just dried out. Beyat sluya, a cooked egg, a roasted egg, asura, is forbidden. Shemen, when it comes to oil, rebuta anosu vezdino nimnu alav veitiru. Of course, we know that oil, rebuta nesia, permitted. Tanya, we learn in the Brisa, he hemtalia, he pashalia, he shiasa. Hemtalia, pashalia, and shiasa are all the zel bazach. They're all the same thing. My shiasa, what is shiasa? It's been 40 years since the story, the shiasa story, came from Egypt. Rabbi Bachana dide Omar ha shisen shnin denofik. Rabbi Bachana himself said, meaning when he's quoting Rabbi Yochanan, he says 40 years. When he's quoting himself, he says it's been 60 years. Where am I? Shisen shin dai denofik hai uvdim time. It's been 60 years since the incident in Egypt. They don't argue. Ma b'shnei, ma b'shnei. Rabbi Yochanan was older than Rabbi Bachana. So Rabbi Yochanan, when he was saying over the story, it was 40 years since. When Rabbi Bachana was saying over the story, it was 60 years since. Maisu bizra de karpisa, that in Egypt they brought a seed of, I forgot what karpisa is. The other day karpisa was celery, but here it's not celery. Here it's something else. I forget. Here karpisa is, I don't remember. Karpisa here is something else. Yeah. Well, how about this? The other day was celery, so let's just say celery now, even though I think it means something else here. Uvizra de kitana, and a seed of flax. Uvizra de shablilta, and a seed of fenugreek. Vitarlu ba'ade adode b'fshure, and they soaked it in room temperature water. Vishav kulei adam ad demekabel, and they let it until, I think it, I don't even remember what that means. They left it, I mean, it's a pretty abstract story. I think maybe they left it until, okay, so they left it until it started sprouting. And they brought jugs, chadati, new jugs, umalulu, maya, and they filled them with water. Vitarubu gargishta, and they soaked clay in that water in the new jugs. Umedapkin bay, and I think they stuck the seeds to the clay. The island live bani, then they went to go take a bath. Adanofku, when they got back from the bath, milavleve, well, then these seeds had sprouted already, and they ate them. They ate them. And it chilled them out from their hair to their toes, to their toenails. Anyways, a very abstract, out there story, but let's go by for a second. Rav Ashi says, Rav Chanina told him, Milain, that this never actually happened. It's just talk. This crazy story never actually happened, where they took these seeds and soaked them in some water, went to take a bath, and by the time they got back, they already sprouted. Some say it was with words, i.e. they used some kind of hocus pocus incantation in order to make this magic happen. But why is this relevant to us? The reason why it's relevant to us is that they used lukewarm water, meaning that it doesn't need to be cooked. And therefore, since it doesn't need to be cooked, there's no concern of Bishul akum when you make hemtalia. The hakuspin shel the chovim. Apparently, when you make date beer, so there would be some like date dregs or something, and if you take those date dregs and you add a stick of water and you heat it up, and they were heated up in hot water, and the oivik chovim heated up in hot water. B'yorah gedola, if it's in a big like vat or pot, osir, so then it's also bishul akum. B'yorah, well, no, it doesn't necessarily it's bishul akum, but if it's a, well, okay, let's go back to it. If it is a big pot, but the concern here isn't bishul akum per se, the concern is about nosin tam. Also, b'yorah kitana mutter, but if it is a small pot where there wouldn't have been, is a small pot that you can't actually fit anything usher in there, then it would be okay. Ve'ezui yorah kitana was considered a small pot. Rabbi Yana says, Rabbi Yana kol she'ein tzipor drawer yochel likanes besocha. If it is so small that a tzipor drawer, a drawer bird, would be unable to fit into the opening of the pot, that's considered small enough that if this date stuff was heated up in there, it would be permitted because there's no concern that anything usher was cooked in there. But maybe a whole drawer bird can't get in there. Maybe if you break it apart into pieces, you could stick the pieces in. If it's so small that even the head, just the head of the bird would be unable to fit into this pot. So it's that small that the head can't fit in. So then you can assume that nothing also has been in there. Therefore, you could consume the date dregs that were heated up in there. Sheesh. So basically, the concern is about it could be that this pot was used for something also, right? So the Overkov is heating up these date dregs, and the concern is maybe that this pot was used for something also. We're saying, but if it's small enough, then nothing also could have gotten in. But another brisa says that regardless of the size of the pot, big, small, doesn't matter, you would still be able to consume this date stuff. Lo kasha, it's no problem. It just depends where you stand on the nosein tam lefgam debate. That when the pot imparts flavor, negative flavor, into the food, is that usher or not? If you say nosein tam lefgam is mutter, so then who cares the size of the pot? Who cares if maybe yesterday it was used for pork? But by today, any flavor that would have been left in the walls of the pot is already not good. And therefore, any flavor imparted in this date stuff would be negative. And it would be nosein tam lefgam. And the question is that usher or mutter. If you say it's usher, well, then you have to make sure to use a small pot that nothing usher could have gotten into. But if you say nosein tam lefgam is mutter, well, then you can even use the big pot. It doesn't really matter. And now for the final stretch, Rav Sheshes says, Rav Sheshes, Hai mishcha shlika, cooked oil, usher. Oh, wait, mishcha shlika, the Aramai, usher. The Aramean cooked oil is usher. Rav Safar, but Rav Safar replied, and he says, Lemai nechush, what are we concerned about with cooked oil? Lemai nechush, imishum iaruve, if the concern is that, well, maybe dovdei kuchavim mixed wine into the oil. But Mr. Sorry, it would ruin the oil, so they wouldn't do that. Imishum Bishul of the kuchavim, if we're concerned about, well, since it was cooked, it's Bishul akum. But nechol hu kemoshu chai, but you can eat oil in its uncooked state. So therefore, it would not be a Bishul akum qualified thing. Imishum giule of the kuchavim, and if the concern is that maybe the pot had released some kind of flavors from the walls of the pot, but nosein tam lefgam mutter, it would simply be nosein tam lefgam, and it would be mutter. So Rav Safar responded that he doesn't understand what the issue should be with cooked oil. These cooked dates, these Aramean cooked dates, what is the halacha? Can you eat these cooked Aramean dates? Well, if the dates are sweet, then certainly they are allowed because you could have just eaten them raw. And if they are bitter dates, well, then certainly they are not allowed because you have to cook them in order to eat them. You wouldn't eat them raw. Or whatever, simply you wouldn't eat them raw, and therefore they're also. The question is, mitzi'ai, what if they're somewhere in the middle? He says, the Rebbe also, what's the question? Rebbe, not Rabbi Nasi, but like our rabbi said it's also. Manu, who's our rabbi? Levi. Levi said it's also shtisoyo. I think it's shtisoyo, I think it was some kind of flour dish. Rav Shari, Rav said it's permitted. Avodah Shmuel, V'Levi, Asur, but Avodah Shmuel and Levi said also. Look, if we're talking about when it's made out of wheat and barley flour, it's certainly permitted because there's not going to be any kind of vinegar or wine or anything in there. But if we're talking about lentil flour, so that was very sweet and they would put vinegar in it. Right? So betlafre bichala, if it was lentils that they had put vinegar in it, kuli amelo plige de aser, obviously it is aser because wine vinegar would be a problem. Ki plige, what they argue is betlafre demayer. If it was made with lentil flour with water, though. So one opinion is that it's also because we say that the water, the lentil flour with water is also out of concern for when there is vinegar. The other opinion says it's mutter because we're not concerned. There are those who say that, look, when it comes to the lentil flour with the water, everyone agrees it's also because out of concern for the lentil flour with vinegar. Kipliga, where they argue, is bechite v'sare with the wheat and the barley. One says also because we're concerned for the wheat and barley flour, since we're out of concern for the lentil flour, which is also. And the other opinion is meh, the wheat and barley flour is fine. Amar Rav Tremine Shtisoya Shadar Barzila Agiladi LeDuvid, says Rav that Barzila Agiladi brought 2 types of shtisah to David when David was running away from Absalom, and Barzila Agiladi gave him shtisah. He gave him 2 types. Tichsiv mishkav ve'sapos ve'kleyotzer chitim v'sorim ve'kemach ve'koli ufu v'adashim ve'koli. So 2 types of koli, 2 types of shtisahs. Ve'hashta hu deka mafke tzoni l'shuka denaydo. And nowadays they bring out containers and containers in the markets of Narda, v'leis t'chayish lo d'avua d'shmo v'levi, and nobody is concerned with avua d'shmo v'levi, who said that it was usher. Nobody seems to be concerned, obviously assuming that there's no vinegar in there, but otherwise it seems that everyone's cool with the shtisah, at least in Narda. That was Naflam Ches of Mesechta Avodah Zarah. It was a very interesting daf, in my opinion. We talked all about Bishul akum, so I think it was very interesting. We talked about to which foods does it apply, right? Things that cannot be eaten raw, things that must be cooked, as well as they must qualify to go on the table of a king. And we also talked about how can we be Bishul akum compliant. And we saw that be'etzem, it just means that the yid has to contribute something, even just a minimal amount to the cooking process, and then you can be Bishul akum compliant. And then we talked about all sorts of random foods and things like that. But that was Daf Lamed Ches of Masechta Avodah Zarah. I think that the sugya on Bishul akum, I think, was an interesting sugya. I think it might come up in other places in the Masechta, but I guess we'll see. That waits to be seen. But have a good one. Peace out.